Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the banner review for patch 5.1 first half. We have Xilonen coming out, and we have a Chiori rerun at the same time, and they're running with Dori, Candace, and Collei. When it comes to the weapon banner, we have Xilonen's new signature weapon, Peak Patrol Song, Chiori's signature, and then we actually have two new 4-star weapons that we'll have to talk about, running with Sacrificial Greatsword, Vonus Warbow, and Rust. Sorry, did I say Warbow? I meant Codex. Yeah, my bad. Let's start by talking about Xilonen. Xilonen is, overall, a pretty good character. Xilonen is the sort of character that is very much designed to be a generalist support. She's not meant to be a hyper-specific support. She's a character that is going to fit in a lot of different teams, and she is actually pretty good in a lot of these teams. If you want to know more about my thoughts on Xilonen, you can always go check out the pre-release. But for those of you that didn't catch it, in terms of the amount of damage that the team is doing, right, in terms of buffs that she's providing, she's very similar to Kazuha. Kazuha offers the ability to use VV and an Ascension passive that gives you 2.04 of his EM as damage bonus, and usually he's anywhere between 800 and 1000. So it's usually hovering around somewhere between 30 and 40 damage percent. If you're putting him on an ER weapon or ER sense, you're generally going to be closer to 30. And if you're putting him on EM weapon and everything EM, just maximizing his EM, he's going to be potentially a little bit above 40, but around 40, more or less. Xilonen, unlike Kazuha, offers resistance shred directly in her kit. So Kazuha offers damage percent in his kit and res shred with his artifact set. With Xilonen, it's the other way around. She offers res shred in her kit. At talent level 10 on her skill, the res shred is 36%, and her artifact set that she can use, the Cinder City, is going to give you 40% damage percent. So instead of 40% shred and between 30 and 40 damage percent, it's between 30 and 40 shred and 40% damage percent. In terms of just actual buffs they're providing to the team, they're very similar, both in terms of the nature of their buff and their quantity. And so, because of that, you're going to see a lot of comparison between the two of them. The main things to keep in mind is, one, they're two different units. And that sounds like an obvious thing if you just say it out loud, but it's specifically relevant because Genshin Impact is a game where in the endgame content, you have to use two different teams. And so having two different units that do something similar won't necessarily be a bad thing, because you might need them on both teams. Or you might want to put both of them on the same team. Or she's Geo, which means she's going to be useful in different seasons of Imaginarium Theater. But outside of that, there's also the fact that there are two different units also means that it's possible you don't have Kazuha. And if you don't have Kazuha and you want to get a unit that fulfills a similar role, you can go for Xilonen. That being said, outside of that, I also want to very quickly mention the main differences between Kazuha and Xilonen. What they're providing to the team in terms of buffs, they're pretty much the same, but that doesn't mean they're the same unit. Xilonen's upsides are that her resistance shred and her damage buff last for a longer duration than Kazuha's buffs, which is very significant. The second upside that Xilonen has over Kazuha is that she doesn't need specific setups to shred resistances. She still needs to get Crystallize of a specific element in order to buff that element's damage with the Cinder City artifact set, but you're not conditional on a specific setup in order to get the resistance shred at the very least. So, for example, if you're playing her in a team like Hu Tao, Xilonen, Double Hydro, when you're doing that with a unit like Kazuha instead, you just give up on getting buffs on Pyro. But with Xilonen, you'll be able to still get at least the resistance shred for your pyro damage, even if you're not able to get the damage percent bonus. That's the second big upside. And the third big upside, and I guess final, is that she can provide healing with her burst. The healing doesn't apply in teams that have 3 or more Geo units, but those teams are ass anyway, so don't play them, which enables Farina more easily. That being said, she doesn't just have upsides, right? Those are the upsides. She also has downsides when you compare her to Kazuha. The biggest two downsides are, 1, she doesn't have any grouping, and 2, she doesn't have any damage. Kazuha's personal damage isn't something that is necessarily going to be that high, but there are quite a few teams that actually care about Kazuha's personal damage a good amount. One of the most obvious ones is Aggravate Kazuha teams, where Kazuha's burst serves as a very, very good way of getting better AoE damage, especially because so many of these Aggravate teams get carried by Fischl, who's pretty much exclusively single target. Having Kazuha to help you in AoE situations when it comes to AoE damage is actually a pretty huge deal for those aggravate teams. Any other teams where you're going to trigger chain reactions, Kazuha's going to end up doing more damage. But even if you're not triggering chain reactions, Kazuha's still doing more damage than Xilonen is. Xilonen's damage is pretty pitiful. It's not very good. So, you'll end up weighing the pros and the cons of Xilonen's buffs while being the same amount, generally being easier to work with and more valuable, versus Kazuha having things outside of buffs that can also make him strong in specific situations. Overall, I don't think I'd say that Xilonen is a better unit than Kazuha, but she's definitely good enough to have a place in the meta. So she's the sort of unit that you definitely can justify going for. I don't think she's necessary because you only need so many units to make two strong teams, and units that have a lot of overlap, like Kazuha and Xilonen, can end up being redundant in your team building depending on which teams you play. But if you want to play her in a team, you're unlikely to regret going for her. Now, let's talk about Chiori. Chiori is a unit that, because of Zhongli's existence, can see a lot of play as a flex slot. Zhongli is a unit that is very, very versatile, that you can put in pretty much any team if you want defensive utility. Any team that doesn't need all four of their slots for a specific thing can make use of Zhongli if you want him and you want defensive utility. And Geo Resonance being as strong as it is, and Chiori having pretty good off-field damage that isn't reliant on team buffs other than getting that Geo Resonance and having some form of Geo Construct, means that the Zhongli Chiori double unit flex core is a nice thing you can add to characters that aren't necessarily in need of a specific elemental application or buffers in their teams. So I guess an example of that is something like Arlecchino, Bennett, Chiori, Zhongli is actually a pretty good Arlecchino team. And Chiori is a unit that can very easily be used in a lot of teams in that way. She's very versatile in terms of the amount of teams you can flex her into, but I wouldn't say that she's necessarily the best option in any of them. Unlike Albedo, who has his fair share of issues and honestly has lost a lot of value over the years, Chiori justifies her presence a little bit better. She's not a unit that I would recommend to anyone who wants to strengthen their account, but she is strong enough that if you like her, you're not going to feel like you're playing a worthless unit. That's pretty much it for the 5 stars on this banner. Let's talk about the 4 stars now. We have Dori, Candace, and Collei. I would actually say that as of October 2024, the best of these 3 units is probably Candace. Candace is a unit that really doesn't offer much. She offers Hydro Infusion, which is pretty fucking worthless on almost anyone. Characters that could scale with hydro damage properly generally don't want to waste a slot on a unit that only does that. The reason why Bennett's Pyro Infusion is useful for some characters that aren't necessarily Pyro if you want to build them for Pyro damage is because he consolidated his role of giving the infusion, but with also giving the biggest attack buff in the game. And it's a similar issue with Candace, who pretty much only offers that, as well as a small damage bonus, a small damage buff of upwards of around 40%. It's not that small of a buff, but that's all she does. It's not enough. It's not over 1,000 attack like Bennett. However, lately we've had some characters that have gotten released that have a lack of synergistic teammates, and the lack of synergistic teammates means that if you have teammates that synergize well, the bar becomes lower. They don't have to be as good. And so, being a Hydro character that gives a damage buff that's not completely insignificant to normal attacks makes her an actual good option in Mualani teams as a way to get a faster Hydro Swirl setup for the VV Mualani teams, and just a unit that isn't completely worthless as a last slot. Candace is actually used in a lot of the speedrun Mualani teams that use VV. And as much as I'm personally not that big of a fan of the VV Mualani teams, if I am to play VV Mualani, it's going to be with Candace, pretty much any time. And then on top of that, you have something somewhat similar with Arlecchino. Candace is C6, giving her just enough Hydro application to consistently vape Arlecchino's attacks, but in AoE, which is something that the good Hydro units that you would usually use in the slot, Xingqiu and Yelan, can't do. They don't have consistent AoE Hydro app, which all in all makes it a lot easier for you to maintain your vapes in AoE situations. Because of these two units, because of Molani and Arlecchino, Candace is now a unit that is part of some of the best speedrun teams for some of the great meta units, but she's also good in general in their teams. She's not limited to speedruns like something like Elegy Amber used to be in Hu Tao teams. She's just straight up a good unit for those teams. And because of that, despite her being overall pretty weak and not offering that much, that really strong synergy is enough to make her, in my opinion now, not that bad. I think it is important to remember though, that with Arlecchino, she only works if she's C6. Even a C5 Candace is completely worthless for Arlecchino. With Molani, the C6 isn't necessary, although personally, I think the C6 makes things a bit easier. Depends on your setup. There's a few caveats to it, but generally, I would still lean towards the C6 being pretty important in those teams. When it comes to her constellations, honestly, none of them matter other than C6. Like, technically, C1 giving you increased duration is nice for Molani, but it's not that big of a deal. Pretty much the rest of the constellations is worthless. And then C6 is pretty good. I haven't mentioned Nilo teams. Candace is also usable in Nilo teams, especially if you're using Yao Yao as your healer. Yeah, all in all, Candace is a unit that definitely aged well. Next up, we can talk about Dori. Dori, like Candace, has a C6 that is very relevant. Unlike Candace, Dori doesn't have a single team where she's usable before C6. Candace is still usable in Molani and to some extent in Nilo teams, even if she's not C6, even if she doesn't work with Arlecchino before C6. Dori, on the other hand, is pretty worthless before C6. She's not completely unusable. You can still use her. She can still function as an electro healer in teams where that's what you need, but she's just not good at it, and she's pretty much never at it than Kuki is. However, her C6 gives her Electro Infusion on normal attacks, and just as, if not more importantly, team-wide healing on doing normal attacks. The amount of healing on this is high. It's a lot of healing. That means that she can become an Electro driver in Farina teams, even without having to be built for full healing, while still providing enough healing for Farina. And so you can build her full damage in a Quick Bloom team with Farina. Her best team is probably Dori, Fischl, Nahida, Farina, and it's actually a pretty good team. Is it good enough to justify trying to go for her C6 just to play that? Probably not, but it is definitely good enough to warrant her being considered as a fine unit if you have her at C6. I think before C6, she's pretty worthless. Her constellations aren't like completely useless, but she's so bad at C0 that the difference between C0 and C5 just doesn't matter. She's still bad at C5. And then finally, we have Collei. Collei is a unit that I find to be very frustrating to play. Her animation on her skill is pretty long, and you can't dash cancel or jump cancel it, and it doesn't have iframes, which makes her feel very clunky to me. And then on top of that, the vertical hitbox of her skill is incredibly thin, so enemies can duck under them if they get knocked down, or jump over them very easily. On top of also having weird horizontal tracking that can potentially make them go around the enemy on the way out and on the way back. Basically, there's a lot of ways her skill can miss, and that's very annoying. Her ult also has similar tracking to Diona's ult, where it will aim towards the middle of the enemy, but if the enemy's jumping, it'll aim, like it'll lock onto the point where they are when you cast it, and if it falls down, it'll just go over them. That's not as bad. That's a lot easier to deal with and a lot easier to work around, but it is another thing to mention. Her AoE is pretty small. She's got some practical issues, let's say. That being said, she does have decent off-field Dendro application that is not limited by her energy generation, and if you put her on Sacrificial Bow, flexible rotations that can adapt to short enemy uptime very well. In a lot of teams, that doesn't really matter because it's not better than Nahida, but there are some teams where you can play her with Nahida, or where Nahida doesn't do that much. Mainly for teams where you're playing her with Nahida, you'd think of Nilo teams. And in Nilo teams with Slack Bow, Collei tends to be a favorable option, especially for enemies that offer very short uptime windows. I remember the first or second time we got the We Nut in Abyss, Collei Kokomi was a very popular way to fill out the Nilo team if you wanted to play it against Mina. I still don't recommend playing Nilo against Mina, but if you really want to do it, Collei is probably your best bet. But yeah, overall, despite my issues with her gameplay practically, she does have her uses. Relevant constellations are C2 and C6 give her more application, and C4 gives her a small EM buff for relearning Collei. It's been a long time since I read anything about Collei. When it comes to evaluating the banner as a whole, I'm very happy with this banner. I'm likely to get my C6 on Collei and hopefully build some constellations on Dori, which I want to get at C6 at some point. But I don't think it's a good banner. There's not a lot of teams where you're going to want to play Candace with either Xilonen or Chiori. It's worth a consideration, I guess, both in Arlecchino and Milani teams to use Xilonen and Candace. Collei, unless you don't have Nahida, I don't really see Collei getting too much play in teams that have Xilonen. And when it comes to Dori, I don't think you really ever want to play her outside of Quick Bloom, so I don't think she works too well with Xilonen. And then neither of the three works with Chiori very well. The banner's not characters that are particularly synergistic with one another, and the 4 stars are very situational. I don't think they're that valuable either if you're looking for strong 4 stars. So it's a pretty bad banner. I think Xilonen being a relatively strong unit is enough to make the banner still worth considering. Next up, we can talk about the weapons. First, we can quickly talk about Xilonen's signature, the Peak Patrol Song. It's a low base attack, high defense percent weapon that gives you 8% defense and 10% all damage bonus twice. So 16% defense, 20% damage bonus, and a team-wide damage percent buff of up to 25.6% based on your defense. On Xilonen, this is effectively just a weapon that gives you 25.6 damage percent to your team. As a support weapon, it's alright. It's a pretty average support weapon. It's going to be relatively good on Xilonen in teams where you're not reliant on Fav putting in some work. It is important to remember that if you are reliant on Fav putting in work, this will increase your ER requirements compared to Fav on the rest of your team. So the actual damage that you're gaining is going to be a bit lower than you'd expect, but it should still be fine. Xilonen's ER requirements aren't that high, even when she's not on Fav, so it's still doable to reach her ER requirements without Fav. But this weapon can also be used on the other defense scaling characters, Albedo and Chiori, and it's honestly probably a pretty good option for them. It's going to be lower personal damage than Chiori's signature, but the team damage should be higher. All in all, it's just a pretty solid option for Xilonen and a very reasonable option for Albedo or Chiori, but it's not that good on the other characters. It's a fine support option on any character that doesn't really scale with any stats and could use some damage bonus, but usually they already have good options, so it's not really a weapon that I'd recommend getting as a generic support weapon. In the same way that I could recommend Elegy. Another thing that I think is very important to mention is that because Xilonen doesn't actually get much out of getting more defense, and again, check out the pre-release if you want to know more about this, but Xilonen doesn't actually get much out of increasing her defense because her damage is pretty worthless. So the only thing you're really increasing by getting more defense is her healing, which is already fine enough to begin with. So it's not like you really need to min-max your defense that much. And what that means is that you can go for a weapon that doesn't have a defense substat. And it makes it so that Freedom Sworn is actually a pretty good option on Xilonen. It is very often either a little bit behind or even sometimes a little bit ahead of her signature. If I had both of them and I could choose between the two of them, I'd still lean towards a signature. But if you already have Freedom Sworn, getting Peak Patrol Song is a little questionable in my opinion. And if you were to choose between getting Peak Patrol Song or Freedom Sworn, I'd say that Freedom Sworn being good on Kazuha makes it probably versatile enough that I'd lean towards it. Anyways, next, we can talk about Chiori's signature. Normal attack damage increased, skill damage increased. If you deal geo damage, effect gets doubled, and defense increase. This is a good stat stick for Chiori or Albedo. There's not much else to say about it. It's a bit more relevant on Chiori than it is on Albedo, because Albedo has much better synergy with Cinnabar Spindle. It's also a fine generic stat stick on other characters, but it's not all that impressive. It's just a 5-star stats thing. Then we have the 4-star weapons. Let's start with the ones we already know. Rust is been in the f***ing garage long enough to pick up Rust. It's bad. No one likes Rust. Rust is a good weapon on Yoimiya, but it's not really necessary because so is Slingshot. In most Yoimiya teams that people actually play, Slingshot is very similar, sometimes even slightly better than Rust. And so Rust is not something you're too happy with. If you have an R5 Rust, I'm not telling you not to use it. It's very possible that it's better. It's going to depend on your team, but it's definitely not something you're too happy to see on a banner, even for Yoimiya, who's the character who synergizes with Rust the best. And it's not good on Child. It's not 2021 anymore. Stop it. Favonius Codex is a lot better. An option that can be worth considering on a decent amount of support characters. The biggest obstacle to Favonius Codex compared to other Favonius weapons is that if you're playing it on a character that doesn't care that much about their personal damage, TDDS exists. And so there's quite a few teams that would rather run TDDS and increase the buffs they're giving to the rest of the team over the particles from Fav. The characters on which you can consider Fav are Lisa, because her ER requirements are fucking insanely high. Mona, because her ER requirements are so high that sometimes it's hard to reach them with TDDS. But if you can reach them with TDDS, you'd rather use TDDS. Heizo, Nahida, Baiju, and Charlotte. And I guess Xianyun as well. That being said, a lot of these characters have viable alternatives, so it's not like you really need Fav Codex that much. Finally, Sacrificial Greatsword. There's a lot less characters that are claymores that care about Sac, or Fav for that matter, because there's not that many support characters that are both claymores and good. Beidou is not really much of a fan of Sac Greatsword. Xinyan is... I mean, she's not very good. There's not much of a reason to play Sac Greatsword on Sayu over Fav unless you're playing her on field. But on field, Sayu's kind of a meme. Not much of a reason to play Sac Greatsword over Fav on Dori if you're playing Dori in her like default just healer. And if you're playing Dori as a driver on field for at C6 with Farina, you'd rather have her on a weapon that increases the team damage, or sorry, that increases her damage. That being said, there are two characters that can actually make use of Sac, so Daya and Navia. Daya, if you put her on Sac, you give yourself the ability to do shorter rotations with her, which matters a lot in both Kanich and Molani teams if you want to play Daya with them. Both of them can be played in teams that have rotations that are less than 20 seconds, but Daya's skill cooldown being 20 seconds can be an obstacle to that. So having Sacrificial Greatsword to effectively just reduce your skill cooldown by 3 or 4 seconds is a good way to increase your team DPS. You can also play it with like Lenny or like Ganyu, but those are the main two. And then Sacrificial Greatsword is just a decent option for Navia if you don't have other good options for her. That being said, I think that Earthshaker has made it a little bit less useful. One of the reasons why Sac Greatsword was a good option for Navia is because Navia did not have a very good craftable option. She did have a pretty solid free-to-play option in the Melusine sword, but that was an event weapon, so not everyone has it. And so Sac Greatsword used to be a very nice option for those that didn't have great options. Tidal Shadow was reliant on getting healing, and if you're using Bennett, you don't heal unless you get hit, which is not ideal. Unless it's Farina Bennett, sure, unless it's Farina Bennett. But yeah, so Earthshaker's release has phased out Sac Greatsword as a Navia option a little bit. It's still a good Navia option. Like, it's still very, very usable. But she has more options now, which reduces Sac Greatsword's value when it comes to Navia. Finally, we have the two new upcoming weapons. Sturdy Bone, high base attack, attack percent substats. Sprint or alternate sprint stamina consumption decreased by 15%. This is completely worthless. Additionally, after using Sprint or Alternate Sprint, normal attack damage is increased by 16% of attack. This effect expires after triggering 18 times or 7 seconds. At R5, it's 32% of attack. This is a fine stat stick when it comes to swords. Overall, you'll want to use this on characters that have shitty motion value. It'll probably be pretty good on Ayato. Ayato doesn't really have good craftable options right now, so that's nice. But as a like banner weapon, like as a weapon banner exclusive weapon, it's pretty bad. It's definitely not something you actively want to see on a weapon banner. Between this and Fav, it's not even a question. And next up, we have the Mountain Bracing Bolt. High base attack, ER substat, decreases climbing stamina consumption by 15%. It increases skill damage by 12%. Also, after other nearby party members use elemental skill, the equipping character's elemental skill damage will also increase by 12%. So it's 24% at R5, it's 48% skill damage. Probably supposed to be a weapon for Emily, I guess. It's alright. Honestly, neither of them are that good. There is another weapon that's coming out this patch. Another 4-star weapon that's coming out this patch is going to be coming out on the second half for the banners, which is the Claymore, the Fruitful Hook. This is pretty much the only good one out of the 3 new weapons, but it's not on this banner, so we'll talk about it in the next banner review. So, the sword is not great, the polearm is not great, Sack Greatsword is not great, Rust is not great, and Fav Codex is pretty good. Overall, the 4-star lineup for this weapon banner is honestly disappointing. It's not particularly good. Not too happy with it. The 5 stars, Uraku Mitsugiri is a pretty solid, just general stat stick, and it's often a little bit better than the other 5-star stat sticks on a few characters. On any character that uses the passives somehow, it's like pretty solid as a stat stick, but it's not like outstanding. If you're looking at this banner, you want to get Peak Patrol Song for Xilonen. Uraku Mitsugiri being the other one on the banner is fine, but you're not going to want to use that on Xilonen, unless you're playing carry Xilonen, which you shouldn't do. If you're looking at Chiori signature, and that's what you want to get, Peak Patrol Song is honestly, it's probably fine to lose your 50-50 to. If you end up getting both, I don't think you'll really find much of a use for Peak Patrol Song unless you also get Xilonen. But if you end up not having enough to go all the way, getting Peak Patrol Song, you can use that weapon on Chiori still. So it's not a complete loss. I'd say the 5-star lineup is not particularly high quality, but it's high synergy. I think the Chiori signature being relatively versatile and the Xilonen signature being a decent option on Chiori means that either way, when it comes to the 5-star, you're not that likely to get completely shafted. But the 4 stars are pretty ass, and I still don't think the 5 stars are that great. I'd say this is a maybe slightly below average banner when it comes to weapons. And like I said earlier, this is a unfortunate banner for Xilonen. But Xilonen is probably good enough to make the banner average, if not slightly better than average. In any case, that's going to be it for the banner review. I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you appreciated my input. Let me know if you're going for Xilonen, Chiori, weapon banner, or any of these characters. And let me know why. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.